Ever get that feeling, you know, like when you were a kid, that there's something hiding under the bed or lurking in the closet?
Oh, yeah, we all had those childhood fears, right? The things that go bump in the night.
Right, exactly. But the BTK case, it's about a different kind of monster. This one, he hid in plain sight. And you asked for a deep dive on this one. You want to go beyond just the headlines.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating case and a terrifying one, even decades later.
So Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, he reminds us that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who look just like everyone else. And we're going to really try to unpack why this case still fascinates and horrifies. We're going to get into what made Rader tick.
And that's the question, isn't it? What creates a monster? Is it something you're born with, or is it nurtured?
And to get into all that, we're drawing primarily from the BTK Killer, A Life of Secrecy, Control, and Terror. It's a tough read, but an important one.
Definitely tough. It forces you to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. But if you want to understand BTK, it's a must-read.
Okay, so let's start with Rader's early life. You know, when you look back on his childhood, was there anything that hinted at the darkness to come? Anything that stood out?
Well, that's the thing. When you look at Rader's childhood, knowing what we know now, there are definitely some red flags. For example, the book talks about instances of cruelty to animals.
It's a classic sign, isn't it? You hear about that a lot with violent offenders.
Exactly. It's often dismissed, just boys being boys, that kind of thing, but it's a pattern. And there were these dark fantasies even in childhood. So the signs, they were there, but were they missed or just dismissed?
That's the big question, right? I mean, if someone had picked up on these signs, could it have changed things?
It's impossible to say for sure, but this is why understanding psychopathy,
Huh.
what we used to call sociopathy, is so crucial. It's not about excusing behavior. It's about recognizing the patterns.
And this is where it gets really interesting and creepy, to me at least. Because Ryder, he didn't just have this dark side as a kid, right? As an adult, he was leading this seemingly normal life. He served in the military, had a wife and kids, held down a job. He was active in his church.
Right. And that's what's so unsettling about this case. You have this guy, your neighbor, your coworker, the guy you see at church every Sunday, and you have no idea that he's capable of such horrific acts.
It's like he had this switch he could flip. Normal guy to monster, just like that.
In a way, yeah. And that duality is what makes this case, and others like it, so fascinating, so disturbing. Was Ryder born evil, or was it something that developed?
And if it was something that developed, could it have been prevented?
Those are the million-dollar questions,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, there are no easy answers. But they're questions we need to be asking. We have to grapple with them.
Okay, so we've talked about the man, or at least the parts of him that were visible. But let's get into the case itself, the impact on Wichita. I can only imagine the fear that gripped the city when the Otero family murders happened in 1974.
It was a horrifying crime that shook Wichita to its core. Joseph and Julie Otero and their two young children found murdered in their home.
I was reading in the book the details. Just awful. Joseph Jr., he was only 11, and Josephine, she was just 9 years old. Just horrific. What made this case stand out even more, even in a city already on edge, was how methodical it was.
Absolutely. And the brutality. This wasn't just about the act of taking a life. He took his time. And again, the details, just horrific. And you asked in your request what made Rader tick.
Yeah.
This need for control, for power, it's a common thread throughout the entire case.
It really is. And it's not just about the murders themselves. He wanted to be known for them. He craved the notoriety. That's where the name DTK comes from, right?
Exactly. Bind, torture, kill. He sent this chilling letter to the Wichita Eagle, the local newspaper, taking credit for the Otero murders, describing them in detail. He wanted the attention. He wanted to instill fear.
It's chilling. Most serial killers, they want to disappear, right?
Yeah.
They want to melt back into the shadows.
Exactly. They crave anonymity. But not Rader. He wanted the opposite. The attention, the infamy. It fueled him. It fed his ego, his sense of power. And that, in a way, is what makes him even more terrifying. Because he wanted to be known. He wanted to be feared.
And sadly for the people of Wichita, that was only the beginning. So after the Otero murders, he just disappears for a while at least.
Yeah.
But the city, they're living with this, right? This fear, this knowledge that BTK is out there somewhere.
Absolutely. The Otero murders, they were in 74, and for the next few years, Wichita was like a city holding its breath, waiting, wondering when or if BTK would strike again.
Because he had to know the police were looking for him. He'd inserted himself into the story, remember? He wanted the attention. So was he laying low? Trying to stay one step ahead of the law?
It's hard to say for sure what was going on in Rader's mind during those years when we're trying to get inside the head of the psychopath.
Hmm.
But the book does a good job, I think, of laying out what we know. And what we know is that BTK, he didn't stay silent for long.
He couldn't resist, could he? That need for control, the need to make Wichita dance to his tune, it was just too strong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your request that you wanted to look at the timeline of the murder. So April 1974, that was Catherine Bright, just a few months after the Oteros.
It's like he was sending a message, I'm still here, don't forget about me.
And then, in 77, Shirley Vienne. And later that same year, Nancy Fox. Each murder, it had his signature. The binding, the torture, the meticulous planning.
And with each murder, the fear in Wichita, it must have been unbearable. The police, they had to have felt the pressure. All those lives lost, a city living in terror, and this ghost, this BTK, just out of reach.
The book goes into a lot of detail about the investigation, the dead ends, the frustration. They had some leads, of course, witnesses, possible descriptions.
Yeah.
But Rader, he was always one step ahead.
He was playing a cat and mouse game with them, with all of Wichita, really.
And winning, at least for a while. Remember how we talked about his need for control? This was the ultimate expression of that need. He was controlling the narrative, controlling the lives and deaths of his victims, controlling the very fear that had gripped Wichita.
It's chilling. You said the police, they had some leads. Did any of those leads pan out? Was he ever close to getting caught during those early years?
There were a few close calls, and he loved that, by the way. Toying with the police, dropping a little hints, then vanishing again. You asked about the communications. He'd send letters, sometimes even leaving messages for the police and library books. Always taunting, always convinced he was smarter than they were.
And all this time, he's living this normal life, going to work, raising a family. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
It speaks to the level of compartmentalization that someone like Rader is capable of. You wanted to understand what made him tick, how he could live this double life. That's one of the questions that continues to fascinate and horrify people about this case.
So the murders continue through the 70s, and then silence. 1991. That's over 15 years without a trace. Had BTK finally disappeared?
That's what everyone hoped. And for a while, it seemed like maybe he had. Maybe he'd moved away or died. But of course, we know now that wasn't the case.
He was right there in Wichita the whole time, living his life, going about his business, while the families of his victims, the entire city, they're all wondering what happened.
And that's the thing about Rader, about this case. Just when you think you understand, just when you think you've wrapped your head around it, he pulls you back in.
Because he couldn't stay silent forever, could he? The urge to inject himself back into the story, it was just too strong. And that brings us to 2004, the year BTK resurfaced. It's almost like he wanted to get caught, you know? Like part of him had to know that reaching out again after all this time, it was risky. What was different this time? What ultimately led to his downfall?
You're right. It was a huge risk. And it was a risk he didn't have to take. He could have stayed silent, kept living his life under the radar, but that wasn't his style, was it? Remember, control. It was all about control for Rader. And you specifically wanted to unpack this part of the case. His undoing started with a simple question. He sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle again after all these years, and in this letter, he asks if it's safe to communicate using a floppy disk. Can you believe that? A floppy disk?
In this day and age.
Yeah.
Seriously. A floppy disk. I mean, I remember those things vaguely from, back in the day, but come on. It's like something out of an old spy movie. It seems so archaic.
Did he really think he could outsmart the police with a floppy disk?
It does seem ridiculous in hindsight, doesn't it? But that was Rader stuck in his ways, convinced of his own intelligence, and maybe, just maybe, there was a part of him that wanted to be caught, or at least that's the theory some people have.
It's fascinating, right? The psychology of it all. But anyway, the floppy disk, it was a mistake, right? A huge mistake. The police, they played along, of course.
Yep.
They assured him a floppy disk was safe. They even sent a message back, Rex, it will be okay. And Rader, so sure of himself, he took the bait. He sent a disk with a message and a deleted file. He thought he was being clever, but the police, they were able to recover the file.
And that was it. Game over.
Pretty much. The deleted file, it linked back to the Christ Lutheran Church. And guess who was the president of the congregation at that time?
Dennis Rader.
You got it.
I remember watching the news when they announced his arrest. It was surreal. This guy, this seemingly normal guy, a pillar of the community, BTK, it just didn't seem possible. So they arrest him, and what, does he confess? Does he deny it? Does he try to explain himself?
He confesses, and not just confesses, he relishes it. You asked about what this case says about the nature of evil. Well, here it is. Sitting in that interrogation room, Rader, he's almost Animated. He's describing his crimes in detail, reliving them to the detectives. No remorse, no empathy. If anything, he seemed almost proud.
It's chilling. And for the families of his victims, I can't even imagine what it must have been like to finally have a face to put to the nightmare they'd been living with for all those years. But to know that he was someone they might have seen at the grocery store, someone their kids might have gone to school with, that's a whole other level of horror.
Absolutely. Imagine being one of the detectives who worked this case for years, only to find out that the monster you'd been chasing was living right under your nose this whole time. And for the families,
Yeah.
there's no closure, not really. Just a different kind of pain.
So, what happened to Rader after the arrest? Was he ever deemed competent to stand trial?
Oh, he was competent, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, no possibility of
Yeah.
parole.
So, he's going to die in prison.
He will, alone with the memories of what he did. And the families of his victims, they can hopefully find some peace, knowing that he can never hurt anyone ever again.
This case, the BTK case, it's one that stays with you, you know? It's a reminder that the scariest monsters, they aren't always the ones in the shadows. Sometimes they're right here, living among us, wearing familiar faces. And that's what's so terrifying.
You're right. It's a chilling thought. But maybe, if there's anything to be learned from all of this, it's that we have to be vigilant. We have to pay attention to the signs, even when they seem small, insignificant. Because you never know who you're really dealing with.
You've really taken us on a journey with this deep dive. We've gone from those chilling childhood fears, the things that go bump in the night, to the very real horrors of the BTK case. We've explored the making of a monster, the fear he instilled, and the long road to justice, however imperfect that justice may be.
We've unpacked a lot, from the psychology of a killer to the impact on the Wichita community and the loved ones left forever scarred. We grappled with those haunting questions about evil, about whether it's something we're born with or something that takes root and grows in the shadows.
If you're looking to delve deeper into this case, remember our expert's recommendation of The BTK Killer, A Life of Secrecy, Control, and Terror. It's a tough read, but a necessary one. As we wrap up this deep dive into the heart of darkness, remember that the most important takeaway is this: stay curious.